Spotlight.
This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. The participants are D.P. Srivastava, former ambassador, and Deeksha Saksena, Akashvani correspondent.
The situation between Israel and Hamas is rapidly evolving in Gaza. On Tuesday, Israel launched an attack on the Gaza Strip. If we quickly go back to 2 months ago, Israel and Hamas began a ceasefire on 19 January, with the first phase lasting 42 days. To understand the current situation and analyze it, we are now joined by Ambassador D.P. Srivastava. Ambassador Srivastava, welcome to Akashvani News.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we discuss in detail, let's first listen to a report from Prasar Bharati Special Correspondent in Dubai on the on-ground situation and the rapidly evolving situation there.
Just a day after the airstrikes killed at least 400 Palestinians. This marks one of the deadliest escalations since the conflict began in October 2023. Earlier, more than 70 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed in pre-dawn Israeli attacks across the Gaza Strip. And now, Israeli military has announced that it will no longer allow Palestinians to move from southern Gaza to the north, effectively restoring a blockade that has been in place for much of the war before the January ceasefire. On Wednesday, Israel confirmed that the military had moved back into the Netzarim corridor, a strategic route that cuts Gaza into half. They had previously withdrawn from this area as part of the ceasefire deal in January. With Israeli troops pushing deeper into southern Gaza, the fear is that this would trigger a full-scale war. The ceasefire had provided some relief. It allowed humanitarian aid to flow in and even led to the release of dozens of hostages. But now, those fragile gains appear to be unraveling. And it's not just Gaza. Overnight, the conflict extended beyond the region. A missile launched from Yemen was intercepted before reaching the Israeli airspace. There were reports that sirens and explosions over Jerusalem, likely from Israel's defense systems, at work. At this point, Yemen's Houthi rebels haven't officially claimed responsibility for this attack. Meanwhile, inside Israel, there is growing public outrage. Thousands of people gathered in Jerusalem last night, demanding that the government prioritize a deal to bring home roughly the 24 hostages still believed to be alive. This remains a rapidly developing situation. This is Vinod Kumar for Akashvani News from Dubai.
Ambassador Srivastava, as we have heard, the situation has escalated once again and the tensions are on the rise between Israel and Palestine. I would like to understand from you what are the reasons for the recent resumption of attacks across Gaza.
I think the answer to this question is related to internal politics of Israel. You would recall that when the agreement between Israel and Palestinian Authority was announced, there were resignations from Benjamin Netanyahu cabinet and Mr. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Cabinet Minister for National Security, he resigned. Now this has had an impact on very thin majority enjoyed by Netanyahu government. They have currently 62 members while the opposition has 58 members. So it's a thin majority of 4 members. And 3 of their coalition members have threatened to leave the coalition unless the government gets them an exemption from a recent order of Israeli Supreme Court that the Haredi, who are an ultra-conservative group, should also serve in Israeli army. Let me give you some background. This group, which is an ultra-conservative group, are opposed to any kind of agreement with not only Hamas but with Palestinians. And they also oppose the agreement for a ceasefire. While they want the war to continue, they don't want to serve in the army. So this has led to a lot of resentment even amongst the Israeli Jews against this group. And recently the Israeli Supreme Court made a judgment that this group should take part in the army and fight for the country. So they want this Supreme Court ruling to be overturned through legislation. This is one of their conditions. So this combination, the two, Itamar Ben-Gvir and this particular group who wants exemption from military service, to appease them, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has taken this step. He has to get the budget passed by 31st March, which is barely 10 days away. And he has this very thin 4-member majority. And in order to keep this coalition together, the government has moved towards a position which has led to resumption of fighting.
But here I would also like to understand from you, is it not related to the Hamas not agreeing to the release of hostages?
I would like to make 2 points. What I just mentioned about the linkage of Netanyahu government's action in resuming the fight and the domestic politics is not my opinion. This is the editorial of Jerusalem Post, which is a very well-known Israeli newspaper. And this editorial of today has made this point. So it's clearly linked to the domestic position, if your question is concerned. Whether it has any link to delay in release of hostages by Hamas, it has to be remembered that the first stage of the agreement, which was brokered by Qatar and other international, Egypt and other mediators, the first stage entailed release of 25 hostages. As against that, Israel released 1,900 Palestinian prisoners. The second stage was to lead to release of the remaining 59 hostages, of which unfortunately 35 are presumed to be dead. So there are only 24 living hostages. But their release is linked to Israel's complete withdrawal from Gaza. Which means that Israel also has to withdraw from Gaza's border with Sinai, which is the Egyptian territory. And instead, Israel has redeployed forces, first in Netzarim corridor, which is the midway line between North and South Gaza. And now they are sending ground forces also.
Since you spoke about the ceasefire which was brokered, it began on 19th of January. So for the benefit of our listeners, I would like you to make us understand what were the terms of the three-phase ceasefire deal, unfortunately of which the second or third phase could not come in force.
The first stage was to lead to release of some Israeli hostages. I mentioned the figure 25 have been released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. That is over. The first stage also involved Israel's partial withdrawal from Gaza Strip while they remain Gaza Strip's border with Sinai. And it also involved resumption of humanitarian assistance. The second stage involved release of the remaining hostages in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from the entire strip, including Gaza's border with Sinai. This is the stage which has never been started. The third stage would involve reconstruction, and for that there are no indications at all.
Could you please walk us through the Gaza Strip's geography? Where were the attacks first being taken when the ceasefire was not, and what is happening currently over there? If you could just tell us.
If you have a look at the map, the northern Gaza, which is Israeli point of view the most sensitive part because it is closest to Israeli territory, and this is the area from which the 7th October attack was launched. This is where initial operations took place, and then Israeli forces expanded southwards in Khan Yunis and areas bordering Sinai, which is now under their control. When the ceasefire proposal was accepted, Israel withdrew from the north, and in a gradual manner, Palestinians were allowed to return to the north. The Netzarim corridor also, which was a midway point, they had withdrawn. Now the fighting has resumed, both in the north and in the south. These are the aerial raids in which today morning, 71 people were killed. So now the fighting is going on both in the north and the south.
If we talk about the humanitarian aid supply, which you also spoke about right now, could you also tell us about the current situation and how is the humanitarian aid being supplied to Gaza? Because that is also one point of contention. And I believe that North Gaza is a place which fears famine. What is the current situation over there about the humanitarian aid?
The humanitarian aid was stopped by Israel on 2nd March. And that has created a huge scarcity, both in the north and the south. I don't think there is much difference between the two parts of Gaza. And unless humanitarian assistance is resumed quickly, the situation will become dire.
I would also like to bring here the US President Donald Trump. So recently Trump said that Israel would hand over Gaza to the United States after the conflict for long term, and US would rebuild it as the Riviera of the Middle East, a real estate heaven. What do you have to say about this?
I think it will be more relevant for your listeners to hear what the Arabs say about it. And the Arab position was made clear in a summit recently hosted by Egypt. This summit included all the major Arab states, including Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and they have collectively rejected the proposal for any proposal which may lead to displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. And they have reiterated Arab demand for a two-state solution. which is the old position, which India also supports, where both Israel and Palestinians should exist side by side and live peacefully. Third, the summit has made certain projections about the amount and nature of humanitarian assistance required, which is $53 billion. But this can start only when peace is reestablished. And they have also come up with an idea that, in the initial period, there would be technocratic regime consisting of Palestinians, but this rules out Hamas, which is Israeli demand. The second stage, the proposal mentions that the government will be run by Palestinian Authority, which will be going back to the situation before 2006, when both Gaza and West Bank were under the same government, which is what Israel has objected to. This is a long-term plan. What implies is that they have not accepted any displacement of Palestinians. They have not committed to replacing Palestinian Authority with some other Arab multinational force. They have emphasized that this is part of Palestine and should be ruled by Palestine.
Ambassador Srivastava, I'm quite inquisitive to know the stand of the mediators, US, Qatar and Egypt. They had mediated the ceasefire deal in past, and what is going to be the stand in future, because Israel very categorically said that these attacks are preemptive and based on Hamas' readiness to execute terror attacks, build up force and rearm. How do you feel that the mediators would negotiate peace between Hamas and Israel?
Of the three mediators which you mentioned, the most crucial is US. Qatar has played a part, but there is resistance to their position. Israel suspects that they have leaned too far towards Hamas' position. Egypt has a role because it's an immediate neighbor, and under President Trump's plan, Palestinians were to be absorbed either by Egypt or Jordan. So it will continue to have a major role. Egypt, of course, doesn't accept the US proposal. But in order to play any mediatory role, first the ceasefire has to be restored. While the fighting is going on, there is unlikely to be any discussion either. It's unlikely that there could be any fruitful discussion about the release of the hostages or to talk about the long-term political solution.
Rebuilding Gaza will cost around $53 billion as estimated by the UN, and it is likely to take decades. The human cost of conflict will also be felt for many, many years to come, and tens of thousands of wounded and left with complex psychological damage. How do you see this humane side of any war?
We have sympathies with people who have suffered on both sides of the political divide. And the fighting started with Hamas' attack on Israel on 7th October 1923, which has to be condemned by all sides. And that fighting has left the Israeli population traumatized. And if you consider the Israeli point of view, there's a certain legitimacy. They had withdrawn from Gaza. They continue to occupy West Bank. But even after withdrawal from Gaza, it is Hamas, which was based in Gaza, which inflicted this wound on them. But in the subsequent fighting, while on the Israeli side about 1,200 people died, the estimates are that the Israeli attacks have killed more than 40,000 people. And this is disproportionate. And this has inflicted massive sufferings on Palestinian people. The entire Gaza infrastructure is destroyed. And rebuilding it while these people, will take about more than a decade. So you have a population which will have to live through this destruction for at least a decade.
Lastly, India's stand on the current conflict. How do you look at this?
India has historically played a very major role in support of Palestinian cause, and it was in recognition of Indian position that when the UN established a Palestinian committee in the early 70s, Arab countries unanimously proposed that India should chair the committee, and India chaired that committee for 9 years. And we have continued our support till today. As you mentioned, the statement of the Ministry of External Affairs has expressed concern about the resumption of fighting. It has stressed the need for humanitarian assistance to be resumed and all the hostages to be released. I think these 3 steps are very well calibrated, needs to be implemented.
Thank you so much for enlightening us with all the facts and joining us tonight on Spotlight.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas. The participants were D.P. Srivastava, former ambassador, and Deeksha Saksena, Akashvani correspondent.
Spotlight.